Afternoon tea at a farm cottage in the South Wales countryside. It was a quiet Monday afternoon in 1993. As far as we know, there was no clue or warning about what was about to happen. The double murder of an elderly couple on their small farm outside Llanharry in the Vale of Glamorgan shook the local community. It was headline news for years afterwards. The victims were Harry and Meghan Toos.
Detectives in South Wales are hunting for a murderer after the bodies of a couple in their 60s were found at their isolated farmhouse.
When police broke in, they found Harry Toos dead with extensive shotgun wounds to his head. The body of his wife was lying just a few yards away.
Just can't understand the reason for it.
It could have happened to us, couldn't it? I mean, we're getting to be the same age as them.
Why did they want to do it to such nice people?
I'm Steve Wilkins. For 30 years, I was a police detective. I want to talk to people who knew the Toos, re-examine the evidence surrounding their deaths. I want to know who killed them. Here's what we know. At around 1:30 on Monday the 26th of July 1993, neighbours heard two gunshots about 30 seconds apart from Tr Farm in Llanharry. Several unrelated attempts to reach the Toos during the early afternoon and evening raised concerns. Police were called, and in the early hours of the following morning, the 27th of July, two bodies were found in the cowshed. Harry and Meghan had both been shot in the head from behind at a distance of about 3 feet. What we still don't know, nearly 30 years later, is who killed them. This is one of Wales' most notorious unsolved murders. You're listening to The Murder Files on BBC Radio Wales. I want to start by visiting the crime scene itself.
As we're actually approaching the scene, the first thing that strikes me is how rural and isolated it is. The chances of somebody just passing and selecting it as a potential location to attack appear to be quite remote. One of the first things you would be asking yourself as an officer leading the case would be, what makes Harry and Meghan Toos potential victims? What is the motive for attacking them?
My father had known them 2 generations, 3 generations.
This is Owen Hopkin. He was a neighbour of Harry and Meghan.
With Harry mostly, he used to help us on the farm, occasionally on the hay and things, and then we used to make the hay on his little farm. And our machines would go there and we'd help him make hay.
Can you just take me through your memories of what happened and what you did on that particular day?
I was sitting in the farmhouse kitchen with a friend having a cup of tea, and the phone rang at 9 o'clock in the evening, and it was the daughter, Cheryl Toos, who telephoned me a little bit distressed and confused that she couldn't get hold of her parents.
Cheryl called her parents every day in the early evening. On this particular evening, she tried calling during the ad break in Coronation Street and got no answer.
Cheryl and I weren't in regular contact or anything, but obviously she had our number in case, I guess, of problems, which must have been why she rang me that evening.
Owen offered to go to the Toos farm to check on Cheryl's parents.
It was quiet, and we went round, knocked the door, and the house was locked. So we shouted and called for Harry. I went to the shed. There was nobody about the yard. I thought maybe he'd fallen over or something. The dogs inside the house, I don't know where they are.
Hi Penny, I'm Steve.
Hi Steve.
Another person who was there in the hours and days that followed was former BBC Wales Today journalist Penny Roberts.
When was the last time you were here, and has it changed much?
No, it hasn't changed at all. I was here about 25 years ago, but it looks exactly the same. The farmhouse, Tiara Wine, the house on the meadow, it looks exactly the same.
And what sort of memories does this bring back for you, standing here today?
I can remember coming here with my cameraman on that morning, and it was a day a bit like today, slightly overcast July. We walked down here and we got within about, I don't know, 12, 20 feet, so we went through this gate. It wasn't sealed off at that point, so we got very close. You know, the yard is the same with the bits of old machinery there, probably the same machinery that was there when Harry and Meghan lived here. It was the same colour, a typical Welsh farmhouse.
We kept looking around some of the buildings. I went next door, asked her if she had Cheryl's number. So there were some phone calls, and I did request to Cheryl that maybe we should call the police. That they're not here, but the Land Rover is here, which is unusual. She was informing me that it was okay because Jonathan was on his way down from London and he'd be there shortly.
Jonathan Jones was Cheryl's partner. They lived together in Orpington in Kent. When Cheryl couldn't get hold of her parents that night, Jonathan offered to drive the 200-mile drive to Llanharry to see if they were okay. Cheryl stayed in Orpington, phoning neighbours like Owen, waiting for any news.
Around 12 o'clock, I said to the neighbour, could I use your phone? We need to phone the police now. It's been 3 hours. That's when I phoned 999.
Owen says the first officer arrived fairly quickly and carried out some initial rudimentary searches of the property. Knocked on some doors and windows, shouted for Harry and Meghan. He got no response.
Some more officers turned up. A dog handler turned up. I was asked if I'd show the dog handler around the fields. We came back to the house, or the yard, and there was a high activity of police there, and the house was open. So I walked into the hallway and I could hear somebody upstairs. So I asked the police officer, is it one of your colleagues upstairs? And he said, no, the son or son-in-law's up there. So Jonathan Jones then came down the stairs, we said hello, and he then went into what I call the living room, where the table was.
This could be a crucial moment in the investigation, which I'll come back to. In the initial hours of a crime being discovered, every action taken and decision made could prove vital to the investigators when trying to establish what did or did not happen.
The bodies of the couple were discovered in the cowshed adjoining their small holding in the early hours of this morning. Home Office forensic scientists and ballistic experts have been examining the crime scene at Tiarrowine Farm.
There doesn't appear to be any apparent motive as to why these two people have died.
So you're baffled at this stage?
Really baffled.
The murder investigation began. This case was a total mystery, and this case had particular challenges for officers, which became all the more apparent to me visiting the site of the murder. When you're looking at it, it's a very, very rural area, isolated farm and outbuildings, and I'm looking as well at potential search areas. It's vast, and this certainly would present a significant challenge to the investigation team, to the resources, but it does strike me as so isolated.
We drove right up where we're standing now and looking down, and I could see blood on the hay bales. I could see it very clearly. We were very near because...
It was the next morning when Penny Roberts and her cameraman arrived. She was the first reporter on the scene.
There were lots of people in forensic clothing and so on doing their job. And then I started talking to people nearby, and you know, what were we told about Harry and Meghan? That they kept themselves to themselves, they were creatures of habit, old-fashioned, they were pleasant, Meghan especially, very smiley, didn't go out ever, didn't socialise particularly, but were perfectly pleasant neighbours.
What sort of discussions were taking place with the officers? Were you able to have access to them? Were they imparting any information to you?
There was a lot of effort put into reassuring the public because, you know, here we are in a lovely peaceful place and two people had been shot in the back of the head, and It appeared at that point to be random, totally random, and I think people were afraid of that. But actually, when you looked at it, when you looked at the victimology and what police found and told us what they found actually in the farmhouse, it became pretty clear that Harry and Meghan either knew their killer or it was someone they were expecting.
If this had been a random killing, I would have expected to find evidence to assist in establishing a clear motive: robbery, sexual element, or signs of a violent struggle. But none of these were present. What you get in actual fact is a couple of things that would lead investigators to think this was somebody Harry and Meghan Toos knew. Firstly, there's a teacup and saucer in the living room. There's some debate as to whether this was their finest tea set, but everyone seems to agree that it wasn't your everyday tea set. Secondly, there was a shirt laid out for Harry in the bedroom upstairs, the sort of thing you might put on if you're expecting company. So, South Wales Police's attention turned to people who knew Harry and Meghan, people who might stand to benefit from their deaths.
If there's anyone out there who knows anything in connection with the brutal murder of both my parents, please contact the police. Please help find the person who has destroyed my life. My mum and dad were my life. They may as well have killed me, too, for all my life is worth now.
2 days after her parents were killed, Cheryl Toos made an appeal to the press and wider public. Sitting alongside her was her partner, Jonathan Jones. That press conference got people talking. Penny Roberts again.
Cheryl and Jonathan didn't behave, and particularly Cheryl, as a bereaved, traumatised daughter. And that doesn't mean she wasn't, because I've spoken to her a lot since, and she was clearly going through hell.
There is no right way to mourn. Everybody responds to grief quite differently. A couple of years later, Cheryl gave an interview to the BBC where she tried to explain what she was going through at the time.
It was also unreal, and I think somewhere at some stage, I'm not quite sure when it happened, but it was almost if I split into two. I just watched myself. I became another person watching myself and thinking, well, what should that person do now? I know my parents didn't deserve to be killed, and I can't cope with the fact that they might have gone through some awful torturing process. You know, mental torture, possibly physical torture. I can't cope with that. So I have to find my own means of coping, my own ways of surviving.
It emerged that a neighbour had heard 2 gunshots at around 1:30 on that Monday afternoon. She thought nothing of it and assumed Harry was out shooting rabbits. But that gave the police a crucial piece of information: the likely time of deaths. Police look to family members in these cases because without clear motive, the question must be asked, who will benefit from their death? And, as a number of historic high-profile cases have shown us, this is usually someone close to the victims. Cheryl Toos was at work all day, but Jonathan's alibi appeared to be a lot more flimsy, and as time went on, suspicion turned towards him. How well did you know Jonathan?
I only knew him as Cheryl's boyfriend and met him a few times.
And what sort of person would you describe him as?
He was polite, he was quiet, spoke quietly, and sometimes Harry would say he was there to help him on some jobs around the small holding.
Jonathan, I think, would be the first to admit that he's, at that time, was a bit of a geek, very tall and lanky, the sort of person who wouldn't say boo to a goose. After
police searches, questions and public appeals, still nobody had been arrested for the murders of Harry and Meghan Toos.
It's now 5 months since the murdered couple's daughter, Cheryl Toos, made an emotional appeal for the public to help find her parents' killers.
It was December, 5 months after the murders themselves, that Jonathan Jones was arrested.
Jonathan Jones, a self-employed recruitment consultant, arrived at Pontypridd Magistrates Court this morning after being arrested at his home in Orpington in Kent yesterday.
He would stand trial at Newport Crown Court in early 1995. The verdict came in April that year.
The man who mourned his fiancée's parents is found guilty of their murder. Jonathan Jones is sentenced to life in prison. Hello, good evening. A 35-year-old businessman is tonight beginning a life sentence behind bars for the
When Jonathan Jones was convicted of the murders of Harry and Meghan, the papers wrote that he'd committed the crime for the money, £150,000 inheritance. But the prosecution in the court openly admitted that no motive was ever established. This was a case built on circumstantial evidence.
I think it was Christopher Pitchford, who was the QC for the prosecution, who said at the beginning to the jury, this is a case of circumstantial evidence, but once you take all the circumstantial evidence into account, a picture will emerge, and the picture that will be emerging for you will be Jonathan Jones as the killer, and that was quite effective, I think, before the jury.
The murder plot was hatched by Jones at his flat at Orpington in Kent. After his arrest,
This is Penny's report from Wales Today. That night, Jonathan Jones was found guilty.
Cheryl Toos stood by him, convinced of his innocence. At the time, she moved in with his family at their home in Caerphilly. That decision...
Cheryl Toos never doubted Jonathan Jones' innocence. So what was the case against him? The Crown's case was largely dependent on 6 pieces of evidence which, at the end of the summing up, the judge referred to as the principal basic facts. There are 2 pieces of evidence that I'd like to focus on in particular. First, Jonathan Jones had no reliable alibi on the date in question. Police couldn't find anybody who'd seen him in Kent, which was where he claimed to be. And second, that Jonathan Jones' thumbprint was found on the cup and saucer that had been mentioned before, the one in the living room. That second piece of evidence seemed to place Jonathan at the scene of the crime.
Well, the fingerprint on the saucer was found some time after the saucer had already been looked at by a number of fingerprint specialists with the police.
This is Stuart Hutton, Jonathan Jones' solicitor,
who could not find a print that was clear enough for appropriate comparison. But lo and behold, eventually this print suddenly was Jonathan Jones's, it was said.
The thumbprint that was found is what's called a partial print, so it wasn't a full clear fingerprint.
Jonathan Jones could not remember handling the saucer, although he was alone in that sitting room for a considerable amount of time.
That's the same sitting room, I think, that Owen Hopkin told me he saw Jonathan Jones going into that night whilst waiting for news. Could he have touched the cup and saucer then without thinking? Barely worth remembering? It is possible. So, even if that saucer did have Jonathan's thumbprint on it, is that really enough to place him at the scene at that particular moment in time?
The fingerprint did not lead to any conclusive conclusion that he was given a cup of tea. I do hasten to add that the cup was not examined for DNA. Somebody had it. Somebody drank from it.
We put the allegation that the cup was never tested for DNA to South Wales Police. They told us that this case has never closed, and as such is still under active consideration. Their spokesman said it would be inappropriate to comment at this time. The thumbprint on the saucer was the only piece of evidence that seemed to directly place Jonathan Jones in the farmhouse, or indeed in Wales, on the day that Harry and Meghan Toos were killed. Like I say, he says he spent the day in Orpington in Kent.
Jonathan took the day off and went to Orpington to look for office accommodation, not for himself, but for his girlfriend Cheryl. And he wandered around trying to find somewhere, and eventually made his way back to the flat at about lunchtime or thereabouts.
When he got back to the flat, there were some people doing some work on the lifts in the building. Jonathan says after seeing them he went upstairs, caught the end of Neighbours and watched some of the coverage of the cricket. The problem for Jonathan was that the lift men said they couldn't remember Jonathan Jones on that afternoon, and more than that, claimed that they weren't even there when Jonathan said they were.
The lift men who were repairing the lift at the time that Jonathan Jones returned from Orpington said that they weren't there. They were doing repairs, but they just weren't there at the time that Jonathan Jones said that he spoke to them, so they denied that he spoke to them. That was overcome when we went to Orpington and got a petty cash receipt, which was so important because one of the lift men joined the group working on the lift late, and he went en route, went to Maplins, so he timed the entire journey and established that the lift men were there at the time. The fact that they couldn't remember Jonathan Jones is neither here nor there, because the lift men have this peculiarity of looking down to carry out their repairs, and sure as eggs are eggs, everybody passing would say, how long are you going to take? Because they want the lift to be working.
This was a case built on circumstantial evidence, and things like the lift workers' petty cash receipt totally undermined the prosecution's evidence.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. I was going to say the light up there can be turned off if you want to.
Jonathan Jones was released on appeal more than a year after he was handed his life sentence. 3 years later, police launched a review of the case. They appealed for new information, and Jonathan Jones sat down for an interview for the BBC.
Okay, so the police say that they're going to conduct this review. They say they're going to leave no stone unturned in this. Mm-hmm. Then can you give me your reaction?
Well, I'm delighted that they're doing something at last. I'm delighted that they're going to leave no stone unturned. It's high time. It's been 3 years since I've been released, and there remain many, many areas of investigation, many leads which have not been investigated yet.
I asked them this morning the fact that they seemed unable to solve the crime at the time. Did they stand any chance of solving it now? How do you feel about that?
Well, I feel angry. There are many areas which are going to be much more difficult to investigate now. There are many leads which would have been better investigated at the time, because of course people's memories fade with the passage of time. People's appearance changes. People are going to be certainly less reliable witnesses. We firmly believe that there's more than one person involved, and we believe we've got good reason for that. And we are determined that the real killers will be brought to justice. In any miscarriage of justice, there's more than one victim. When an innocent person is put in jail, guilty parties go free, and only half of the equation's been corrected thus far.
One of the reasons that might lead Jonathan, or anybody else, to think that there was more than one person involved in this was the nature of where the bodies were found. Neither Harry nor Meghan was killed in the cowshed. Their bodies were moved there, likely carried. Was one person strong enough to move them by themselves? So where does that leave us? Are there any suspects that we missed?
3 days before Harry was murdered, he went to a firm of solicitors with described as a smart man, smart gentleman, and what was discussed we haven't been able to find out. We know that Harry was concerned, concerned about a will, but we don't know more than that. Now, despite requests for information, the smart man has never come forward. The smart man has never been identified.
Another character never identified, but someone who knew Harry Toos. Who was that smart man?
Detectives who are looking again into the murder of Harry and Meghan Toos 13 years ago say they're...
In 2006, police made a fresh appeal for information. This time they were looking for two specific cars.
The public's eye, two vehicles that were seen in the area. One was a 4x4 vehicle, a black vehicle, the other one a red saloon.
The extra 20 officers now working on the case will go out into the community to help find the extra information which police say will solve the crime.
But here we are 15 years later, and this crime remains unsolved. It's been more than 28 years now since Harry and Meghan Toos were killed. 28 years, and there's been no justice for them. Back with Owen Hopkin and his wife Maya, I want to get a sense of how the community has responded, and is still responding to the events of that day.
There was a fear because we didn't know who or how many murderers there were out there. It could have been one, it could have been two, it could have been more.
I think there was a lot of fear in the community when it started. We were living in an isolated farmhouse ourselves, even more isolated than Harry and Meghan. It just made you feel a little bit on edge, really.
Looking back now, 28 years ago, what are your thoughts now as the fear amongst the community now
Fear has subsided.
Yeah.
But I think, like most people, we'd like to see justice for Harry and Meghan. But nothing seems to have happened since.
South Wales Police have told us the murders of Harry and Meghan Toos remain unsolved. However, this case is not closed and remains under active consideration. They say they will assess any new information that is provided to them. They will review the physical evidence against any advances in forensic science which may provide further potential opportunities to detect these murders. If you have any information that might be able to help the police, you can contact them via social media or by emailing swp101@south-wales.police.uk or calling 101. I remain a firm believer that justice can be done. In this case and many more like it. I've seen it before. The truth is out there somewhere and can be found by those with the will to find it. A quiet evening in late summer 2005. In this close-knit community, everybody looks out for each other. Through the wall of their terraced house, a neighbour hears a disturbance. Concerned, they call their neighbour's family. Little could they have imagined the terrible crime that had taken place. Their neighbour was dead. 18 years later, this community still has questions because they still don't know who killed her. Everybody seemed to know the victim. She was referred to fondly as Auntie Elsie. Her actual name was Elsie Hughes.
The 90-year-old widow lived alone, but had a network of concerned relatives and neighbours to help out.
Elsie Hughes was loved and respected by everyone who knew her. She was always there for those who needed her.
This was a savage and sustained attack on a defenceless lady in her own home at night.
I'm Steve Wilkins. For 30 years I was a police detective. I want to talk to Elsie's family and to the police who investigated her murder. Why has nobody ever been brought to justice? And what hope is there of a conviction all these years later? Here's what we know. Elsie Hughes was 90 years old. On the 8th of September 2005, at around 8:30 in the evening, a neighbour heard a disturbance at Elsie's home. They called Elsie's daughter, who came by and found a dreadful scene. Her mum had been assaulted. She'd been left for dead in the front room of the house she'd lived in for nearly 60 years. Elsie lived on a busy road. There was a number of appeals for information. But still, all these years later, nobody has ever been brought to justice. You're listening to The Murder Files on BBC Radio Wales. This is Arden Road in Abermothy, in the community of Hope, Flintshire.
It's a busy road this as well, so Elsie's house. At the time of the murder, all these houses were covered in scaffolding. They were all being renovated.
I'm meeting Chris Cochrane, a former detective with North Wales Police.
You can see new roofs, pebble dash frontages. So there was a lot of scaffolding, a lot of workmen about, which made it a bit more difficult.
Just tell us what your role was in the investigation.
I was brought into the investigation as the senior investigating officer, probably 2 weeks or so into the inquiries.
We're standing across the road from Elsie's old house. She was 90 years old when she died, and they lived in the same property for nearly 60 years.
Can you, as best you can, perhaps describe the scene and what the actual family found when they discovered Elsie?
It would appear, although we can't be definitive on this, but it would appear that whoever committed this crime had gained entry through the front door, so it looked like Elsie had opened the door to someone calling for whatever reason. They may have barged their way in past Elsie, that she may have let them in for whatever reason, unknown. But as soon as you open the front door, the staircase is in front of you. To the right is a door entry to the main lounge. Elsie was found between the settee and the front lounge window near the radiator on the floor, and sadly left in a pool of blood.
Elsie Hughes was 90 years old. She lived at home by herself.
This is Mavanwi Kirkwood, Detective Inspector with North Wales Police.
Very independent, self-sufficient lady, a pillar of the community. Lots of people knew her. It was a September evening in 2005 when Elsie was at home on her own. Her daughter came round to find Elsie battered and beaten and in a very poor state. She was taken to hospital and she later died.
In the days that followed, news and information about this sudden attack spread. The community was in shock. Who could have done this and why?
Scenes of crime officers are still at Mrs. Hughes' home, collecting any potential clues. They say it's still too early to say whether anything was taken from the home, but they can say there doesn't appear to be any sign of forced entry, and the fact that the killer seems to have slammed the door when he made his getaway could lead to his eventual capture.
The one thing that might have offered the police some hope in those early days of the investigation was the fact that it was a busy road. You can hear the traffic constantly passing by whilst I chatted with Chris Cochrane at the scene.
Well, as you come just to the junction at the top there, you go straight on from Mould. It runs parallel to Caergurley. So there's a little castle behind here, which was a bit of a touristy spot. There's a little lane that goes down, it's a footway that goes to the back of the castle. So it's a main traffic route between Wrexham and Mould in many ways. Leads on to the A55 eventually, if you carry on going this way. So it's a busy route.
The noise alerted at least 2 neighbours who saw a 6-foot-tall man of slim to medium build walking up the street. He was wearing a white hooded top and black tracksuit bottoms.
So there's lots of potential witnesses, and early on in the investigation, a possible motive too.
Potentially, we believe, the only motive could be is theft or robbery.
Reading about this case, it's clear how loved and respected Elsie Hughes was in this local community. It is also clear how close and supportive her family were. I want to get a sense of who Elsie was as a person, so I sat down with her granddaughter Helen.
She was fun, she was caring. I mean, look, everyone says that their nana is an amazing person, and she was. So trusting in everybody. Everyone had a fantastic word to say about her.
Elsie had been a dinner lady at a local school. Generations of children in the village had grown up knowing her.
In the village, she was known as Auntie Elsie. That's what everyone used to call her. Loads of people got in touch with me, people that I didn't even know, saying how fondly they remembered her. You know, she wanted to fatten them up if they were a little bit thin in school, and they all remember her.
Elsie clearly made such an impression, and so the impact of the crime was felt deeply, not just by her family, but by the whole community.
She'd always be bobbing around in the village. I mean, obviously, as she got older, She had problems with her knees, and she did have replacement surgery, but she did become a lot less mobile after that. So people didn't see her as often around in the village, but she'd always have people calling into the house to see her. She'd always have someone there having a brew. She was just such a lovely, caring person, and she would, you know, if you gave her a sob story, she would have given you her last penny. And that was the kind of person she was.
Is there any particular lasting memory that you have got?
I think probably not so long before it all happened, when we got married. And my husband got married in the May, and she was just hilarious at the wedding, and she just absolutely, I think that was her dream, if you like, to see her granddaughter get married. And she was cracking jokes with all of our friends, and they had lasting memories of her, you know, after that. I suppose that sticks in my mind the most, really.
So this was a community that would rally behind the family and rally behind Chris and his investigation. Police gathered evidence at the scene. They made inquiries in the local area, and one thing they were able to ascertain early on was the fact that Elsie Hughes had been a victim of a crime not all that long before.
The entry into the house at the time was difficult to ascertain. Because of the scaffolding, there would have been windows open, people could have climbed in easily without needing any obvious forensics. But it was more likely that Elsie opened the door to someone, the front door, and either they badged their way in or she's let them in, and it may have been another attempted distraction burglary.
As Chris says, in August 2005, Elsie Hughes had been a victim of a distraction burglary.
Where cold callers had come and tricked their way into the house and stole her life savings, £1,000 plus, that she had. The house was ransacked.
Mrs. Hughes had been the target of a distraction burglary a few weeks ago, and a large sum of money was apparently taken. Officers say it's one line of inquiry they're following, and people here should remain vigilant.
Distraction burglaries are a particular type of crime. Was there any other in the area around the time, or in neighbouring forces, which may have perhaps shown that the offenders were from outside the area or travelling through?
There was a series of offences both in North Wales and in Cheshire, our neighbouring police force, where there'd been the type of distraction burglary may have been window cleaners looking for business, but actually looking for opportunities to gain entry through a window, but obviously looking for people who were more vulnerable, the elderly, the weak, the frail, and then taking opportunities.
Would never have asked for help off anyone. She's a very proud lady, so, you know, she did it all on her own. But if you needed anything, she'd have just given it to you, which I think upsets me more, that this was so unnecessary, because she would have just given anything to anyone if they'd have just asked her. It was just such an unnecessary and evil thing to do.
Distraction burglaries were not uncommon at the time. There's every chance that what happened to Elsie a few weeks before had nothing to do with her murder, but it was a line of inquiry the police were pursuing at the time. Another line of inquiry came from eyewitnesses. We heard earlier about the guy with the hooded top. Police were keen to talk to him. What had he seen? What did he know? But there were other people they were keen to get in touch with too.
There was people that, or sightings of individuals. Can you tell us more about that? People, persons of interest?
Well, just 150 yards away from Elsie's house is a Chinese takeaway. It's local. It's been there for many years. It's still operational. It's used as a local chippy, as a takeaway, and there were some sightings of vehicles close to. One in particular was a small blue transit van, which was distinctive because it had ladders on the back and it had small windows at the rear. And a local witness had described this with two males.
It's important for a police inquiry to establish who was in the area. The slightest bit of evidence can help take the investigation forward.
At the same time, there was another vehicle which was a form of people carrier, and that had two persons, a male and a female in. It could have been somebody just travelling through and stopped for a meal, but they'd been there for several hours. They never ever come forward, the couple from that vehicle, despite numerous pleas from police appeals. Nothing could come from that couple. So that vehicle was still really of big interest.
Unable to trace the van themselves, detectives released the information to the public via the media. They did a reconstruction. That might jog people's memories, might help them remember that vital clue.
Detectives are banking on the chance that a new witness who lives or works or was driving along this road last Thursday will remember something significant after seeing the reconstruction.
If these potential witnesses came forward, they might be able to identify Elsie's killer.
Detectives say they're especially keen to trace a couple seen in a people carrier. They're also anxious to talk to the driver of a dark-coloured escort van which was parked in the area.
Police would track down the van, but it would not, unfortunately, help their investigation.
The blue transit van was identified eventually and traced to a traveller camp in Ellesmere Port. Unfortunately, when we arrived at the camp to try and recover that vehicle, it had been disposed of at a local scrapyard and actually squashed.
Two men ended up pleading guilty to perverting the course of justice for disposing of the van. Whilst both the defence and prosecution in court both agreed that the men in question had not done it to hide their own guilt, they agreed they had impeded the murder investigation. It could well be there was no valuable evidence at all to be found in that van, but we will never know. And for a murder inquiry, who are trying to gather all the evidence they can, this could well have held them up. For a family watching on as the police investigation continued, the effect was unimaginable.
What sort of impact did it have on you?
Oh gosh, it was absolutely huge.
Here's Elsie's granddaughter Helen again.
I think, to be honest with you, we were just all in complete shock. And I don't think that wore off. And months, maybe years later, it's only just recently, obviously, we've been talking about it as a family, and there's like basic things that we don't remember at all, you know, basic questions that you think you would ask at the time that we just can't remember because it just washes over you. You know, you've got the police coming over every day to try and update you with things, but you're not taking any of that in because this horrific event has happened and your brain just isn't working. You're just not taking anything in at all.
So what evidence is outstanding in this case? Where are the clues that might lead police to catching Elsie's killer? For starters, there are still potential witnesses the police have not yet identified.
There was a male seen leaving, or very close to the scene, Elsie's house, and running down towards Crossways.
Police had descriptions of this male, enough to put together an e-fit photo and released it through the media.
And then continue to run or walk down towards the railway station and into Hope Village proper. A male, 25 to 30 years of age, a white hooded top, hood was up, black leggings, white trainers, quite distinctive trainers.
This man is believed to have been in a takeaway nearby earlier on in the evening. He is thought to have spoken to a couple outside. Police appealed to him, or anyone who knew him, to come forward.
Again, that person unfortunately was never identified, still outstanding.
I can see no reason why the murder of Elsie Hughes would not be a detectable case. And I want to get a better understanding of how the investigation had proceeded since those early days. At North Wales Police Headquarters, I met Detective Inspector Evanwy Kirkwood.
So I'm responsible for the major crime team, so we deal with any major crimes such as homicides, so we deal with those live as they come in, and also we look at the reviews of them, so any cases that are unsolved, we would periodically review those, so I have ownership for those.
And obviously we're talking today about the murder of Elsie Hughes in 2005. Is that a case that you will be actively reviewing?
Yes, so what we do is anytime we have any information in, we will look at that information, see whether we can maximise that and look at a particular part of an investigation. And we have regular meetings with our chief officers to look at what we can do about those reviews, whether we need extra staffing and things like that, and able to conduct a full review.
Every murder is tragic, but in particular when we're talking about a 90-year-old lady who is a pillar of the community, it leaves a lasting impact on that community. Can you give us some sort of idea of what that's like for the local people?
Yeah, it's had an absolutely huge impact on the community. It's a small community, people know each other there. Even though it's quite a busy road that Elsie Hughes lived on, lots of people knew her. She used to work in the local school. She was a great grandmother. People looked out for her. You know, people did her shopping for her. For this to happen in such a small place and in such a small community, it's massive for them.
We've talked about the potential outstanding witnesses, and the police are still eager for them to come forward. I think there are forensic opportunities too. As science progresses, what investigators can find is truly extraordinary. Angela Gallup is a leading forensic scientist, having worked on some of the most high-profile cold cases in the UK. Can you explain what trace evidence actually is?
As forensic scientists, we deal with physical evidence. That's things that you can actually see, albeit sometimes with a microscope, but you can see it or touch it or feel it or smell it or whatever it might be. And the thing about so a lot of our evidence is comes in tiny amounts and is what we would call trace. But the other thing about forensic science is because people commit crime in all kinds of environments, some of them indoors, some of them outdoors, forensic science, or the traces we're interested in that are transferred from one person to another, or from a place to a person, or a person to a place, or a vehicle, or whatever it might be, can be of an enormous variety of different kinds.
So scientists like Angela are looking for the smallest particles. And these days, they can detect things that weren't detectable a few years ago. That's the sort of thing that really can give hope in historic murder cases like this.
Things like clothing fibres and hairs and skin flakes and those sorts of things, and paint and glass, and so they're sort of particulate. They're sort of small particles of things that we're very interested in. But it can be almost anything. It can be pollen grains. It can be soil. It can be constituents of soil. It can be absolutely anything. It can be tea leaves. It can be tiny shards of porcelain, as in one case I did.
I talked to Chris Cochran about the forensics in this case and the difficulty with gathering trace evidence in a busy crime scene.
The difficult part is, of course, in an ideal world, when you go to a crime scene, you want it preserved and get the best forensic evidence possible. When you have an old lady found in a house by her family members in such a serious state, ambulances are called, paramedics come, people are trampling through the scene. The priority is preservation of life, so we have no problem with that. And then you try and recover from all of that mix forensic evidence, which may lead you to trace an offender. But there are still opportunities.
There are still opportunities. In fact, I think there are probably more opportunities now than there were 18 years ago.
Forensic science has moved on significantly since that period of time, and a lot of successes of cold cases are in a result of the review and the forensic opportunities. Is that still good today?
Absolutely. So forensic science, as you say, has moved on massively in the last few years, and it continues to develop all the time. So what we would do at a crime scene is we would gather all of that information, and we may not be able to get any forensic results from it at the time, but we would always look to, if there's a new process, run it through that process. Our forensic science team work on these reviews regularly with us. They have the meetings with us, so they're aware of what's available, and we do remain hopeful that in time we will get the forensic results that we want.
Yeah, I'll just record until it starts and see in case that. Yeah. I'll just wait. We'll give them a couple more minutes.
Detectives did uncover one piece of evidence at the scene that they had held back from the media and public at the time. They only released the details of this evidence 3 years after Elsie's death.
This latest appeal is being made 3 years on from the savage attack on 90-year-old Elsie Hughes, which led to her death.
Police made a new appeal and released this information in September 2008.
I can today release details that footprints from a Nike Court Tradition training shoe, sized between 7 and 9, were found at the scene of the crime. The shoes, we believe, are white in colour and have the Nike tick logo on the side. We now believe the time is right to go public and to ask for the public's assistance, because somebody knows something about this crime, and this may be the final link in the chain for them to come forward and give us the information.
3 years after the murder itself, this wasn't about physical evidence. There's a good chance that no longer existed. This was another appeal for witnesses.
I ask that if anybody does have any information at all, that they contact North Wales Police.
Where was this footprint?
There were a number of footprints found from within the home of Elsie Hughes. We're not going to go into any more specific details of that at this time.
If somebody seen somebody disposing of what would have been a new pair of trainers at the time and burning them for no reason or destroying them for no reason, that would stay with you. So people have knowledge.
Some people listening to this programme might say, well, it's 18 years ago, what opportunities are there? Why are you starting to look at these cases? Why is it still important to North Wales Police to do so?
It's important to get justice. It's important to get justice for Elsie Hughes and her family. They've had to live with this for almost 18 years with no answers to their questions. And as I said before, the impact on the community is absolutely huge. We owe it to Elsie Hughes to keep looking. And I would say to anybody listening to this, if you know anything, please come forward. Please tell us. No matter how small that information is, even if you think the police might know that, don't rely on that. Come forwards and tell us. It's really important. It's important to North Wales Police, and it's important to Elsie Hughes and her family.
Will North Wales Police ever close the books on this one?
We'll never close it, no. Major crimes such as this that sit within my unit will always remain open. We will always keep looking. So if anybody out there knows anything, be reassured that we will continue to look at this and we will continue to look for those answers.
I'm confident those answers could still come. They might well come from advances in forensic science. They might well come from new witnesses coming forward. It's unimaginable what a family goes through in the wake of a tragedy like this.
I think the police believe that, and I think you're speaking to yourself, that somebody must know who was responsible for taking the life of your grandmother. If you have an opportunity now to either to speak to them directly or to somebody who has vital information, what would your message be?
I would just say, if you know anything, which I am sure, like you say, somebody does, just put yourself in our shoes and just think, how would you feel if this had happened to your nana, your family? How would you feel? What an evil act to do to someone who was so frail. It had, there was absolutely no need to do this at all. How can you live with yourself if you've done this, or if you know who has done this? If anyone does know anything, then all I can just say is, please just think if it happened to you, and just come forward if you know anything.
If you are responsible for this crime, you need to come forward. You need to come and tell the truth. You need to take that weight off your shoulders and anybody else's shoulders that knows this information, that have had to live with this for the last 18 years. Do the right thing. Do the right thing for Elsie Hughes and her family, and come forwards.
If you have any information that might be able to help the police, you can contact them via 101 or anonymously via Crime Stoppers 0800 555 111. There is every chance this case is detectable. Every chance the family will get justice. I hope for their sakes, and for Elsie's, they do. A postman on his rounds on a cold, snowy morning in Mould in Flintshire. It's around 7:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning in February 2003. Little does he know he is being watched. Moments later, he's set upon, struck multiple times in the head. He would die later that morning in hospital. The postman's murder was the talk of the town, and it made headline news. That postman's name was Paul Savage.
Detectives launch a murder inquiry after a postman is battered to death on his delivery round.
Mr. Savage's colleagues have already begun laying flowers at the scene. A Royal Mail spokesperson said they were shocked and appalled to hear of the attack.
We have, we believe, 2 young men responsible for this very vicious attack on a postman for no obvious reasons.
A police appeal for information on the anniversary of the murder of a postman produced just one call from the public.
All I ask is that we catch whoever is responsible.
I'm Steve Wilkins. For 30 years, I was a police detective. I want to talk to the officers who investigated Paul's murder, look back over the evidence, and understand why this case has been so difficult to detect. Ultimately, I want to know who killed him. Here's what we know. At 7:30 a.m. on February the 4th, 2003, Paul Savage was delivering the mail on Clayton Road in Mould. One witness reports hearing the mail dropping through his letterbox and looking outside a few moments later to see a man lying in his driveway. Paul had received 6 blows to the head. The same witness calls the police. He also spots 2 people running away from the scene. Paul was taken to hospital and died. Despite a prolonged police investigation, nobody has ever been convicted of his murder. You're listening to The Murder Files on BBC Radio Wales.
Steve, long time no see.
I'm just off Clayton Road in Mould. Here I'm meeting Chris Cochran. He's a former detective and was the first investigating officer on the scene after the assault on Paul Savage that morning in February 2003.
There was no reason for an assault on a postman at 7:30 in the morning on a cold, snowy morning. There's just no rationale for why somebody would want to, unless it was a robbery. But nothing stolen, nothing.
I want to get a sense of the area to better understand what happened that morning. Chris talked me through the scene.
Just at the back, when you turn behind the Dolphin Pub, where you turn left,
Yeah.
there's a small roadway there which takes you to the post office sorting office. So that's where Paul Savage started his journey, if you like, that morning. Paul Savage was pushing his push bike. The young girl says she's seen a couple of local lads hanging around at the time. It's early morning. Commuters were going to work. This is quite a busy road in the morning.
Yeah, it looks busy as you hear there's cars passing us.
It was snowing. Well, it had been snowing. So it's a bit sleety. And just beyond this car, I think that's the scene, thereabouts.
Little did Paul Savage know there was somebody watching him that morning.
They wouldn't have known that he was going to stop there and deliver post. It's just that he parked his bike there, but they were lying in wait. They preempted that somewhere along here they were going to strike him.
You go through life, you can accept you're going to lose your mum, your dad, your granddad, your nana. You don't go through life thinking one day your son's not going to come home.
Your granddaughter's daddy's never coming home.
June White is Paul Savage's mum. She wanted to take part in this programme, but did not feel well enough to do so. What you'll hear of her in this episode is from archived BBC footage. Paul Savage was new to the area. He'd moved to a village nearby from Greater Manchester with his wife and young daughter. He was 30 years old and setting up a new home with his family. June White was staying with them on the night of February the 3rd.
On the Monday evening, I got my granddaughter settled. She was in bed, and we settled downstairs in the cottage. And Paul had to be at work in the morning, so he retired.
Paul left the house before anyone else was up the next morning to start his fateful round. At about 7:30 in the morning, Ray Dodd, a local councillor at the time, heard some letters dropping onto his mat. It was a couple of minutes later before he looked outside. He could hardly believe what he saw.
It wasn't a pleasant scene. There seemed to be an awful lot of blood. Subsequent reflection, I think it's seen more because of the snow on the ground and it spread through the snow. And he was still alive, choking for breath, gasping for breath.
Ray rushed outside to Paul's aid.
So I stooped down and spoke to him, said probably words like, "Hang on, I'm going to ring an ambulance." Ran back in to get the portable telephone from here, then ran back down to the gate, and I think I stood in the middle of the road in the snow, madly dialing 999 and saying, "Get help urgently."
That's when we got the phone call that there'd been an accident. Yeah, an accident.
June rushed to the hospital in Wrexham, where Paul's wife was already waiting.
There was a lot of police presence as well as medical people. And I looked at his wife and I said, "It's okay. It's okay." But I knew because I was his mother. In intensive care. It didn't look like a big handsome Paul. No. That wasn't Paul lying there.
June would have just a few final moments with her son.
His head was all bandaged up. Few cuts. He was covered. The machine was beep beep, beep beep, beep beep. And then the line just went. We had maybe 90 seconds. Hugged him. He was warm. He was still warm. That's one of my memories. He was warm. If I could have picked him up and took him home, I'll make you better. Because little boys growing up with a grazed knee or a split head, you make them better. But I wasn't making him better this time.
As June and the rest of Paul's family started to try and come to terms with what had happened, a life taken so quickly, so unexpectedly, the police investigation began in earnest. It was now a murder inquiry. For people who don't know Mould as a town, as a community, give us some sort of idea of the sort of location, the communities that we're talking about, Chris. Here's Chris Cochran again.
Mould is quite an affluent town. It's a market town. It has markets twice a week. It's a really nice place to live. It's in the middle of Flintshire. The people are. It's a nice locality. It's a nice place to live. People look after each other generally. Mixed population in terms of age. There wasn't a massive amount of crime in Mould. Manageable. Not a lot of violence. Generally speaking, that's why this was so unusual. It was a really one-off, very unusual event to take place. And I think it did frighten people.
One of the first things that officers established from local witnesses was that 2 people were seen running away from the scene. The 2 people were immediately of interest to the police, and they made a public appeal.
So police at this moment are appealing for any witnesses at all.
This is a report from BBC Radio Wales just a few hours after the attack.
Now, at the time of the attack, 2 young men were seen standing by his bike and by the mailbag. They were approached by a neighbour who just had mail delivered by Mr. Savage, and when he walked towards them, they ran off towards town. Now, the 2 youths are described as being between 18 and 20 years old, both wearing hooded tops over their heads, and that's all we have on that at the moment.
I did see two youths going down the street. The recall I have was that I thought crossed my mind, have they been messing with the postman's bike, which was against my gate post, you know. But they moved off, and I was probably going upstairs to get my coat or whatever, you know. It was no more than a moment's glance in the darkness.
I'll walk you down the scene.
Yeah.
So from here, obviously, when we got here, the ambulance had taken Paul Savage to hospital. So all we were left with was a murky mess of footwear everywhere in the snow, melting. I was seeing the crime officers trying to recover, and they did. They recovered about 95% of the footwear and identified about 95% of the footwear. The baton, one of the murder weapons down the grid, floating up and down. And then there's witnesses to say they've seen two men running down the road.
Yeah. So as a senior investigating officer, what's your first impressions? What can you see as the challenges you're going to face?
The problem we had, because it was early morning and snowing, there'd been paramedics, there'd been local passers-by, there'd been people stopping to have a look. So the scene was all contaminated anyway with a massive footprints in the snow, which were melting away. A lot of the blood and DNA had obviously gone down the drains. But one bonus was the drains were full because of the flooding and the snow. So one of the murder weapons was a wooden baton, which was floating in one of the grids where they dropped it down.
The murder weapon was a wooden baton. The hope with any physical evidence like that is that it will contain useful clues pointing you towards the killer. It can also be used in a court at a later date.
The first murder weapon was in the grid right outside. They just dropped it straight down in the hope it would be washed away, but because it was a wooden baton, it was sort of bobbing up and down, so we recovered that one.
And we can see actually with the weather now, the rain, that actually that drain that you're pointing out is probably one of the main drains that is taking the water away from the road.
Obviously we searched all the drains for the second weapon, to no avail.
With physical evidence recovered at the scene and a handful of witness statements, North Wales Police needed the help of the local community to help identify Paul's killers.
And there were people either walking or travelling by car up and down Clayton Road at this time.
Chris and his team held a press conference to appeal for the public's help.
Not all of these witnesses have come forward so far. We believe that the attackers are local men. Please allow your family members to speak to us. Support them. We know it takes courage to come forward, but we must not be too afraid that it allows dangerous and violent criminals to get away with murder.
Paul's mum, June, was at the same press conference.
My son, Paul, a postman, a husband and a father to my granddaughter, went to work on Tuesday morning, the 4th of February, posting letters. He never came home. I held my son that day at Wrexham General Hospital. He died. Every mother in the world knows how I feel. All I ask is that we catch whoever is responsible. We would like to lay Paul to rest now. Thank you.
Hold on. Thanks.
I thought Chris's words there at the press conference were interesting. He said, "Please allow your family members to come forward. Juvenile witnesses, witnesses under the age of 18 would need parents' permission to testify." When we were walking up and down Clayton Road, I was surprised how busy it was. And standing on the spot where Paul was assaulted, you're surrounded by houses. There's a school just at the bottom of the road, but remarkably few witnesses came forward.
There's a lot of reluctance from people, unbelievably.
And it appears, Chris, that sort of reluctance for people to come forward and perhaps engage continued during the investigation.
All the way through.
What's your thoughts on that? Was there any particular reason for that?
The two suspects we had were obviously suspected by locals as well, tough guys, and I think people were partly reluctant against reprisal, and I think there was a couple of families in Mould who they were giving us some informal information but would never make a statement.
There can be all sorts of reasons why people won't come forward to make statements. Firstly, could be just that people didn't see anything. If you think about your commute to work this morning, or the last time you went to the shops, do you remember everything and everybody you saw on the way? Would you remember seeing a postman delivering the mail? Secondly, as Chris suggests, people could be afraid of the criminals themselves. These guys were clearly dangerous. This attack was violent. And third, as Ray Dodd suggested in this interview at the time, there was a difficulty for some to accept that such dangerous people could live amongst them in such a nice community.
It would have perhaps been a more satisfactory explanation if we felt that it had been outsiders from the town who visiting had done this, and then other people in town would be confident the same thing was not likely to happen to them. The police, though, as you know and as I know, are convinced the perpetrators of this were local to the community here, and that worries people.
Whilst the police did what they could, June White took it upon herself to keep her son's case in the spotlight, to make sure Paul was not forgotten.
Could I just show you a picture? But I'm just here on a visit, that I don't want him to be forgot.
June visited Moll regularly with a photo of Paul, trying to jog people's memory, encourage anybody who knew anything to come forward.
Is that okay?
Still looking, still...
Yes, but it won't be long.
Paul Savage's mother, June, was here every day campaigning on the streets. She did what every mother, you might expect every mother to do. She was relentless in trying to get evidence.
Sometimes I thought, would they have cared if he'd been born and brought up in the vicinity? Or do they not care because he was new? If he'd lived there 30 years, just round the corner or across the road, would they have done more?
Investigating Paul Savage's murder and trying to allay fears in the community and say people shouldn't be unduly concerned. But this morning, even post office staff continuing his round were in pairs. The floral tributes have been arriving in a steady stream. We didn't know you for very long, but thanks for being a good mate, says one. Police are still baffled as to the motive for the assault on Mr. Savage.
For a variety of reasons, witnesses have not come forward. A Crime Watch appeal for information in the months after Paul's murder resulted in just one phone call. Even when police did speak to people who knew something, they would not go on record. They wouldn't make formal statements. Two months after Paul's murder, 5 people were arrested and questioned in connection with the case. 3 of those people remained on police bail for a year, whilst inquiries continued, but no charges were ever brought against them.
The first 24, 72 hours of any investigation
You're dependent on the officers first attending the scene, is securing the evidence, making sure you're providing the best opportunity for the expert witnesses, the scientists, for the scenes of crime officers to attend and recover that evidence for you to maintain its integrity, which gives you then the forensic opportunities. But on top of that, you've got other evidence, you've got witness evidence. But at the end of the day is that it's all well and good having good intelligence. You have to turn that into tangible evidence where somebody will go and stand in a court and give that evidence to the jury for them to make decisions on.
There's some mother out there what knows. There's some sister what knows. Maybe some daughter what knows. Some father what knows. How can they live with it?
Chris, how you doing? Steve, how you doing? Oh, yeah, you well? I want to know a bit more about how the investigation has progressed since 2003. I'm meeting with Detective Inspector Chris Bell. He's been the senior officer on the Paul Savage murder for the past 5 years.
Back in 2018, I was asked to carry out a review of the brutal murder of Paul Savage in Mould in 2003. So at that time, I reviewed the case, looked at opportunities, revisiting witnesses, forensic opportunities, and actually did a witness appeal back then for Crime Watch. We did a roadshow live back in, I think it was June 2018.
What sort of impact has a crime like this have on a community like Mould?
Huge. It hasn't gone. If you go there, people living in that area still talk about it. When we did that reenactment in 2018, a number of neighbours came out and they immediately knew what we were doing because it's a close-knit community. When you compare it to the more metropolitan policing areas, it's small. So when something like this happens, it has a huge impact on people's lives. People were living in fear. And people will never forget that.
I can tell from Chris's tone, from how he speaks, that he's invested in this case. He wants it detected. He wants a conclusion. A case like this, do North Wales close the books on it, or is it something that you continue revisiting?
Never close the case, because this is such a high-profile case. Everybody wants closure on this. We never close any cases, in particular something as high-profile as this. It's always left open. We get intel reports shared with us, whether it be direct through the police or Crime Stoppers, which is the favoured method, and that's continually reviewed for opportunities. I would love nothing more than to be able to detect this, not only for the mother of Paul Savage, June, who I'm in contact with regularly, but for the public as well, and for Paul Savage and his immediate family. You know, what happened to him was horrific. The public, I believe, know what's happened. I do think there's opportunity out there for somebody to come forward. Coming up to the 20th anniversary in February this year, people's perspective might have changed. People who were perhaps vulnerable at the time because of their age or circumstances, maybe they were too close to the suspects. Maybe they've had a different perspective in life, and I use this opportunity really to appeal to them. Whilst we can't know what June and her family's gone through, we can imagine with fair certainty that she's gone through a horrific ordeal over the last 20 years. What I would like to do is to be able to look her in the eye and tell her that we've got justice for her son.
I want to be at that court. Might take a while. The trial will take a while. It could be 3 of them, it could be 5 of them, it could be... But I want to be there, no matter where. And I want to be in that court and punch the air and go, yes, Paul. Yeah.
The most tragic part of revisiting this case at this time is that June is that much older. The chances of her seeing justice for her son are getting fewer and fewer by the day. I mean, we're almost the 20th anniversary of the murder now, Chris. Do you still, or do you think that it's still detectable?
I do. I think it could be totally wrong, of course, but I still believe it's local. And of course, those juvenile witnesses at the time are now in their 30s. And we would hope that they would, come forward now, be stronger people, able to make their own decisions, and give us some real evidence.
Standing at the crime scene, nearly 20 years after Paul Savage's brutal murder, the determination of Chris Cochran, the first investigating officer at the scene, is just as clear to see as it was then. If this is detectable, as Chris seems to think it is, where will the evidence come from? What leads do North Wales Police today have to go on? There appears to be some very, very good witnesses. What would you say to those people now, nearly 20 years on?
Okay, what I would say is that I understand the predicament that you were in at that time. I understand that it wasn't easy and perhaps you felt a little bit vulnerable, but policing has moved on a long way since then. What we can offer people in terms of protection, what the courts can offer in terms of protection as well, and special measures should you choose to be a witness through the court process. There's a number of different special measures that we've got now that we didn't have at the time. These people don't stop becoming dangerous. They could end up harming somebody else.
A really important piece of physical evidence was the murder weapon itself, the baton that police found in a nearby drain. I wanted to know from Chris Bell how science was helping his team get that little bit closer to Paul's killer. What sort of advances in forensic science, modern day forensic science, how can they assist you in relation to reviewing this type of case?
Back in 2018 we did a review because there was advancements in DNA testing technology, which basically means that they need less of a sample to get a DNA profiling, which once loaded up to the database can identify potentially a suspect if they're known, and that's constantly evolving. Are
you hopeful that with forensic science, the fact that you've got the murder weapon, that still provides you with opportunities that you can pursue?
Yeah, every touch leaves a trace. I'm touching this table now, my DNA will be on that table. The advancements of technology, the advancements of forensic science is getting so good that that's all that we could need. So I'm hopeful, continually evolving, that because we have that murder weapon now, we can apply new methodology to it, and I'm hopeful that that'll give us the opportunity that we need.
And those who are responsible, Chris, and perhaps people who are protecting them, should they be fearful that North Wales Police will carry on pursuing this until they reach a successful conclusion?
We will never stop looking. So those people who have been looking over their shoulder for 20 years, let them know that they need to continue looking over their shoulder, because we won't stop looking. Every opportunity that we get, we will explore, and we just need that little bit more, and we'll come for them.
If you have any information that might be able to help the police, you can contact them via 101 or anonymously on Crime Stoppers on 0800 555 111. As in many other crimes that I've seen, a little bit of information can go a long way in helping to solve a murder like this. It still means the world to the victim's family. They deserve justice.
This video was uploaded to the channel Thinking Out Loud. Please like, comment and subscribe to the Thinking Out Loud channel. Thank you.
June 1985. A private shop on a busy street in Swansea. People pass by, unaware of the horror unfolding just a few feet away. A murder was taking place, and it would become one of the most notorious in the city's history. The body was discovered by the shop's manager. He found her lying in a pool of blood. The victim was a mum and a wife. She'd only been working the shop a few months. Her name was Sandra Phillips.
At about 1:30 today, a man making deliveries to the private sex shop discovered the dead body of a woman inside the premises.
South Wales Police are reopening their investigation into the death of a sex shop manageress 17 years after she was murdered.
He told me that he knew nothing about the murder, but he had made a statement to the police confessing it.
Sandra Phillips murder is the 5th unsolved case in the South Wales Force area to be looked into by an independent reviewer.
I'm Steve Wilkins. For 30 years I was a police detective. I want to understand what happened in the investigation of Sandra's murder. Police got it wrong, and I want to understand how that has impacted on the case since. Here's what we know. On the 14th of June 1985, Sandra went to her job at a sex shop in Dilwyn Street, Swansea. At 2 p.m, the area manager came by and was surprised to find the door to the shop was locked. He let himself in and found Sandra covered in blood and doused in petrol. Later examinations would reveal she'd been beaten and sexually assaulted. Now, almost 4 decades later, we still don't know who killed Sandra Phillips. You're listening to The Murder Files on BBC Radio Wales. Dilwyn Street in Swansea.
Well, who could believe that a mother running a private shop like this in the middle of Swansea, it's not seedy around here?
Penny Roberts is a former BBC journalist. She lived in Swansea in 1985 and remembers what the city would have been like.
There would have been lots of people wandering around. Who could believe that someone could go into that shop, lock the door and batter a young mother to death?
The murder immediately made news.
So far, there was no apparent motive for the murder nor any sign of a weapon, and he appealed to anyone who should in at the shop today to get in touch with the police immediately. Complete confidentiality will be guaranteed.
And because this was such a busy street, a busy part of town, there were lots of people about, lots of potential witnesses, lots of potential suspects too.
She was last seen outside the shop at about 20 to 12 yesterday, talking to a young man. That possibly is the last time she was seen alive. And then she was found dead in the shop at about 1:30 yesterday afternoon.
What do you know of that young man?
Well, we know that he's about 25, 26 years of age, about 5'10", athletic build, and he was wearing what appeared to be a jogging jacket, which has some red flashes on the shoulders.
Just on the corner there's St Helens Road, which is full of grocery shops and restaurants, and that is what it was like back in the day. We're looking at a road, it is busy, but it's skirting the city really, and people I suspect are going to the big Tesco's just down the road. But there would have been a lot more people walking at that time. And of course just down there, a few 100 yards away, just over the road, very, very close to the private shop, is a residential area. So Swansea's quite strange really. You've got the city centre, theatre just to my right here, but shops just down there, and beyond those, just barely beyond them, terraced houses. So it was busy.
All was quiet today at the house in Forest Vach where Mrs. Phillips lived. Meanwhile, police inquiries centred on the private shop are continuing. About a dozen of the shop's customers have contacted police, but there are at least 200 more on a list of members of the shop's video club.
It was a terribly sad story. A wife and mum killed whilst doing her job.
Sandra Phillips was in her 30s. Her partner worked just a few hundred yards from the private shop where she worked. He was manager of the local co-op and he was working there that day. She had a family, she had a daughter, and she was struggling to make ends meet, like many people in those days. They needed a second income, and the job of manager of the private shop came up, and she'd only been in the job for 2 months. She was quiet by all accounts, and a loving mother and wife.
There's little doubt one of the reasons the story captured the public's imagination so quickly, in part, was because of the kind of shop Sandra was working in. That would also be a challenge for the police. As we heard a moment ago, there were more than 200 people who were members of the shop's video club, but they didn't necessarily want to be known. Many other men who would have frequented the shop might well have been embarrassed about coming forward. It is also a sad fact about this case that Sandra would be remembered as the woman murdered in a sex shop.
There would have been a stigma attached to that job, most certainly, and there was a lot of embarrassment with people coming forward after the murder, and certainly, I think Sandra got tarred with she was working in a sex shop. As it happened, she was just doing a job.
It was just after lunch on the 14th of June 1985 when the shop's area manager came by. He was surprised to find the private shop on Dilwyn Street locked. Using his spare set of keys, he let himself in and found a scene of horror. Blood everywhere.
It wasn't long before the police came. The police station is not far away, about half a mile I'd say, and they came down and started to put a cordon up.
As the police and forensic experts gathered, so did the usual crew of accessories to high drama. A crowd of journalists, curious onlookers, and inevitably the two Darvell brothers.
The Darvell brothers, Wayne and Paul, were two lads from Neath. It wasn't unusual to find them hanging around Swansea city centre at this time of the day.
They had been involved in petty crime before. They were relatively well known as having been petty criminals.
This is Dr. Sam Poyser. She's a criminologist from Aberystwyth University.
They were homeless individuals, at least they laid down in hostels and so on, that they roamed the streets by day. We might say they came from the wrong side of the tracks, or at least they were sitting on the wrong side of the tracks at this particular time in their lives.
Wayne and Paul Darvell's mother died in 1981, and they lived in Neath. And their life spiralled downwards. They came to Swansea. They were always spotted hanging around the city centre, more often than not with a flagon of cider in their hands. They were a nuisance. They used to commit petty crime when their booze ran out, and they'd spent the last of their money down the amusement arcade.
These were certainly two young men not unknown to the local police. And their appearance that day, the day of Sandra's murder, immediately attracted officers' attention.
Wayne in particular, he was somebody who quite liked to be the centre of attention. He quite liked to turn up to the police station or turn up to officers on the beat and say he knew information about a crime that had happened locally when he didn't have that information, or the information he provided was clearly of no value. He was seen as a kind of police groupie, if you like. He was fascinated by police work, apparently. He enjoyed being around police officers.
With few people who'd been in the shop that morning coming forward, police turned their attention to the Darvell brothers. They picked them up, brought them in for questioning. It seemed the police had made a breakthrough.
There were 6 separate interviews of Wayne Darvell, and in the third one he confessed.
Wayne Darvell confessed to being present at Sandra's murder. He said his brother had committed the crime. They were charged, and the news was met with a great sigh of relief from the local community.
I do remember it very well. There was a lot of talk about a madman, a murderer being on the loose, and I think everybody was very, very relieved, because it happened quite quickly, that Wayne and Paul Darvell were picked up. Everybody was relieved, because this was an awful murder.
An 8-week trial followed, and the brothers were found guilty. Paul Darvell was sentenced to 20 years and Wayne to 15. That ought to have been that. But for many in the local community, something didn't sit quite right about the Darvell's conviction. It left a lot of unanswered questions.
Rose Williams was the manager in the private shop before Sandra.
They used to come into the shop when I was working there, and sometimes they'd want to buy a magazine.
This is from a BBC programme a little while after Paul and Wayne Darvell were sent to prison.
Wayne especially would do some mimics, and he was quite funny, you know, brighten you up on a bad day. Harmless enough, you know, not the type to sort of do what happened to Sandra. They didn't have a motive for a start off. When they used to come into the shop, if they had a motive, they would have probably tried and given me trouble along the way. But there was nothing at all with them. There are quite a few in Swansea that are capable of it, but the DeVell brothers aren't.
A programme called Rough Justice started to investigate. They started to ask questions. The answers they found were deeply troubling.
Many people in Swansea think that, innocent or guilty, Paul and Wayne Darvell are better off in jail. Two brothers, eccentric, shambling, noisy, homeless. A twin nuisance, a double blot on the Swansea landscape. These two brothers were sentenced to life for a brutal murder here in a Swansea sex shop. Rough Justice believes they are innocent. They were convicted because one brother confessed under police questioning. After a 6-month investigation, Rough Justice has discovered new evidence about Wayne Darvell's so-called confession. Ever since he was a child, Wayne Darvell has been confessing to crimes he could not have committed. That's Rough Justice on the case of the Darvell brothers. Too convenient a conviction?
It might seem pretty extraordinary that any doubt would be cast on the conviction of the Darvell brothers. After all, Wayne had confessed. But as I know from personal experience, people confess for all sorts of reasons. And policing was very different in 1985 than it is today.
Back in the 1970s and the 1980s, police used a much more, let's say, confrontational form of interviewing.
Sam Poyser again.
The key focus, the goal, if you like, of that form of interviewing was to gain a confession. So police officers interviewing suspects would go into the interview room with that goal in mind.
These days, a police interview is about trying to obtain information, trying to figure out what happened. But back then, the style and culture of policing put a lot of pressure on suspects. So it's true to say that Wayne Darvell did offer a confession, but soon he retracted it. Here's what his lawyer told the Rough Justice programme.
He told me that he knew nothing about the murder, but he had made a statement to the police confessing it. He told me, and I'm looking at my original notes, he'd been forced to confess by the police. He said he'd tell them everything that happened, and they'd said he'd get bail and not be charged.
Many people have falsely confessed and still do falsely confess.
I've seen people confess to things they didn't do. Sometimes they do it voluntarily, but on some occasions it's arguably because pressure's been applied.
There are three essentially different types of false confession. The voluntary false confession, and then the other two are coerced false confessions.
A coerced confession is a confession in which the interviewer might ask leading questions. Sometimes, in rare cases, the suspect will even start to believe their own confession, but often they just want to say what the officers want to hear.
He liked to please people. His old teachers say that he always confessed to things because he wanted to help.
It's motivated really by the want to get out of that situation, the want to escape, if you like, from the kind of intolerable pressure that they're under. And I do highlight that that doesn't need to be physical pressure. I'm talking about oppressive questioning here.
After the Rough Justice programme, it was decided to re-examine the murder of Sandra Phillips. Another police force, Devon and Cornwall, were brought in to look it over. What they found was a series of serious errors that caused the convictions of the Darvell brothers to be called into question.
There were things that really were not right with Wayne Darvell's confession.
Another thing about police interviews in 1985 is that the only way they were recorded was on paper by the investigating officer after the fact. Devon and Cornwall brought in electrostatic detection equipment to look at the notes detectives had taken after Wayne's confession.
It was clear that the notes of Wayne's interrogation had been written up quite a long time afterwards, and it was clear that there had been some level of change made to the original notes. They had been rewritten to make the questions that were asked appear non-leading.
Once the confession was out of the window, the rest of the case unravelled.
Their clothes would have been covered in blood, they would have smelt of petrol, but nothing, no fibres, no fingerprints, nothing was found that linked them to the scene.
And local uniformed officers came forward, apparently at the time, that Wayne Darvell and Paul Darvell were pulled in for the murder, and told the detectives that were in charge of the case that Wayne was a serial confessor. He would always volunteer information that was invariably useless in cases. Therefore, that there should have been a red flag around this suspect.
It does beggar belief. And, you know, there were rumblings. I knew Mark Hancock, who was Wayne Darvell's solicitor. You know, I remember him saying at the time, you know, this is rubbish, this is rubbish. And I think, though, everybody believed the police. If the police said they'd done it, they must have done it. There was an element of that, certainly amongst the general public, that the police had gone in, done their job, and he'd confessed.
For so many reasons, miscarriages of justice are a blot on policing. They lead to a loss of faith in the police. They lead to false hope for the victim's family and the wider community. But worse than that, perhaps, they can make detecting the crime that much more difficult.
Sandra Phillips' case is a really good example of where a wrongful conviction leads to kind of a double injustice, an overlapping injustice, because the key victim was Sandra Phillips. Her family have not achieved any kind of justice, if you like, any kind of closure. They've not seen the conviction of the guilty party or parties in this case.
I mean, what I find extraordinary that it didn't unravel in the days and weeks following the murder, because I remember people saying, well, you know, this is ridiculous, it can't be them.
The victim of the crime and their family often get forgotten because some of the things that are revealed in relation to wrongful convictions when they're eventually uncovered are pretty unpleasant, and so the focus tends to go on the wrongly convicted. But of course the family of the person, in this case it's the murder victim, still also haven't achieved justice.
Wayne and his brother Paul were released from prison in 1992. Their convictions were overturned by the Court of Appeal, and the Sandra Phillips murder investigation was back to square one. So what evidence did the police really have to go on? Well, firstly, there were eyewitnesses.
I was passing the shop at 11:15, and I saw a chap fiddling with the door. He was trying to lock it.
Remember, this had been a busy lunchtime. There were a lot of people who'd seen something.
He failed to lock the door. He went back into the shop and he left the door ajar, and I could see the light on in the shop, but I couldn't see into the shop.
Can you describe this man at all?
He was a thick-set gentleman. I would have said his age was around 50 to 60. With my job, I was expected to keep a record of all my official journeys, and this meant keeping a diary with the times I left and returned to the office.
So you can be positive about it being 11:15?
Yes.
As well as witness evidence, detectives started to think about physical evidence too. Advances in science since I became a police detective are extraordinary. I wanted to get a better insight into this side of policing, and called one of the UK's leading forensic scientists. Angela Gallup has helped to crack many of the UK's most notorious murder cases. Dr. Gallup, I joined policing over 40 years ago. What significant changes have happened in the forensic science world since then?
Oh, it's just so completely different. I'm difficult to know where to begin. I think in my particular area, sort of, forensic biology, certainly been DNA. It's absolutely amazing when you compare it with what we were able or not able to do with blood grouping, which is what we had before. So you can get results from tiny amounts of material. I mean, stuff you can't even see. We can do things with degraded DNA that we couldn't do before. We can look at male-only DNA and DNA inherited down the female line. We've got databases now, DNA databases that we can look at.
There's been some significant successes relating to cold case reviews of historic murders over recent years, and indeed you have been at the heart of many of those. Why are we now seeing successful prosecutions?
I think it's two things. I think one thing is we've got the technology now that really enables us to find tiny amounts of material that would have been missed before, simply because we couldn't find it in the first place, or if we did, we couldn't analyse it in the second. So I think we've got all that, but I think we've learnt such a lot. I mean, every cold case that I and my teams have done have taught us something new and something we can apply to the next case. And I think some examples of this are that we've learnt something actually that I think we always knew, but my goodness, it's been pressed home on us, but that it's really important to start with a crime scene. And however old the case is, it's really important to go back there, if you can, and get an idea of what the place looked like and what was possible and what wasn't possible, or what was unlikely, and so on. So really, really important to understand that, because that's actually ultimately where your forensic opportunities come from. But also, amazingly sometimes, I mean, I remember one of the cases I was being involved with, we scraped away the paint that had been applied in the intervening years, and we found some of the murderer's blood still there, which is extraordinary. But so it is, there's lots of reasons for wanting to go back.
Following on from some of Angela's successes, the investigation into Sandra's case did exactly what she recommends. They returned to the crime scene. They even pulled down a false wall to find any evidence they might have missed.
Sandra Phillips was found beaten and strangled 17 years ago in Swansea. Now police are reviewing her case.
By 2002, South Wales police were reinvestigating a range of unsolved murders. Sandra's case was one of a number at that time that had led to miscarriages of justice. But it was time to put that right.
South Wales police put their act together. They were finding the killers, the real killers of murders that had been subject to grave miscarriages of justice.
It's part of a series of reviews into unsolved murders being carried out by South Wales Police.
There were hundreds of boxes of evidence that they sifted through.
The review will be carried out by the former head of Merseyside CID, Albert Kirby. The force says it'll focus on scientific developments made since Sandra Phillips's death.
South Wales Police has had considerable success with cold case reviews, being one of the first forces in the country to set up a review team in 1999 to conduct cold case reviews. The knowledge of the criminals has changed as well. 30 years ago is that they may have thought by wearing certain garments that they were forensically aware, and that was protecting them from fingerprints and DNA or blood groupings. Whereas obviously as time has moved on, a lot of the forensically aware criminals are now falling foul of modern day scientific techniques.
Yeah, and they think all sorts of things. They think if they change their clothes, and if they, all kinds of ways in which they can think of getting around things. But it is, we can usually think of a way around that. So, as long as we go on being able to do that and having the samples to do our work on, that's the key thing. Then we should be okay.
Swansea in those days was still a very busy port. There were fishermen, there were cargo ships, there was a lot of building work going on in Swansea, so a lot of people were coming in and out. And of course, with a sex shop, people don't necessarily want to come forward and say, hey, I've used this shop. So the police found it very, very difficult.
South Wales Police say all historic murder cases remain under active consideration and will be the subject of reinvestigation as and when new information is received. The statement adds, each case is reviewed periodically. If information comes in from the public or other forces, we act on it.
In the days and weeks following the murder, that's the golden time for police investigation of this kind. And of course, during that time, everything was focused on Wayne and Paul Darvell. So it could have allowed the real killer to get away. And of course, the more time that goes on, physical evidence deteriorates or gets thrown away, and people's memories fade.
If you have any information that might be able to help the police, you can contact them via 101 or anonymously via Crime Stoppers on 0800 555 111. I believe that even in a case such as this one, there should always be hope. There is still valuable evidence out there. It's never too late.